Hello. This is part 2 of reading Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, the remarkable true story of the American capitalists who financed the Russian communists. Anthony C. Sutton. American bankers and Tsarist loans. In August 1914, Europe went to war. Under international law, neutral countries, and the United States was neutral until April 1917, could not raise loans for belligerent countries. This was a question of law as well as morality. When the Morgan House floated war loans for Britain and France in 1915, J.P. Morgan argued that these were not war loans at all, but merely a means of facilitating international trade. Such a distinction had indeed been elaborately made by President Wilson in October 1914. He explained that the sale of bonds in the United States for foreign governments was in effect a loan of saving to belligerent governments and did not finance a war. On the other hand, acceptance of treasury notes or other evidence of debt and payment for articles was only a means of facilitating trade and not of financing a war effort. Documents in the State Department files demonstrate that the National City Bank, controlled by Stillman and Rockefeller interests, and the Guarantee Trust, controlled by Morgan interests, jointly raised substantial loans for the belligerent Russia before the United States' entry into the war, and that these loans were raised after the State Department pointed out to these firms that they were contrary to international law. Further, negotiations for the loans were undertaken through official U.S. government communication facilities under cover of the top-level green cipher of the State Department. Below are extracts from State Department cables that will make the case. On May 24, 1916, Ambassador Francis in Petrograd sent the following cable to the State Department in Washington for forwarding to Frank Arthur Vanderlip, then chairman of the National City Bank in New York. The cable was sent in green cipher and was enciphered and deciphered by United States State Department officers in Petrograd and Washington at the taxpayer's expense. For Vanderlip National City Bank, New York, 5. Our precious opinions, credit strengthened. We endorse plan cabled as safe investment plus very attractive speculation in rubles. In view of guarantee of exchange rate, have placed rate somewhat above present market. Owing unfavorable opinion created by long delay, have on own responsibility offered take $25 million. We think large portion of all should be retained by bank and allied institutions. With clause respect customs bonds, become practical lien on more than $150 million per annum, customs making absolute security and secures market even if defect. We consider 3 years option on bonds very valuable, and for that reason amount of ruble credit should be enlarged by group or by distribution to close friends. American International should take block and we would inform government. Think group should be formed at once to take an issue of bonds. Should secure full cooperation guarantee. Suggest you see Jack personally. Use every endeavor to get them really work, otherwise cooperate guarantee from new group. Opportunities here during the next 10 years, very great along state and international financiering, and if this transaction consummated, doubtless should be established. In answering, bear in mind situation regarding cable. Mac Roberts, Rich. Francis, American Ambassador. There are several points to note about the above cable to understand the story that follows. First, note the reference to American International Corporation, a Morgan firm, and a name that turns up again and again in this story. Second, guarantee refers to Guarantee Trust Company. Third, Mac Roberts was Samuel McRoberts, a vice president and the executive manager of National City Bank. On May 24th, 1916, Ambassador Francis cabled a message from Rolf Marsh of Guarantee Trust in Petrograd to Guarantee Trust in New York, again in the special green cipher, and again using the facilities of the State Department. This cable reads as follows. For Guarantee Trust Company, New York. 3. A loaf, and self-consider the new proposition takes care a loaf, and will help rather than harm your prestige. Situations such cooperation necessary if big things are to be accomplished here. Strongly urge your arranging with city to consider and act jointly in all big propositions here. Decided advantages for both and prevents playing one against the other. City representatives here desire handwritten such cooperation. Proposition being considered eliminates our credit in name. Also option, but we both consider the ruble credit with the bond option in propositions. Second paragraph offers wonderful profitable opportunity. Strongly urge your acceptance. Please cable me full authority to act in connection with your city. Consider our entertaining proposition satisfactory situation for us permits doing big things. Again, strongly urge your taking 25 million of ruble credit. No possibility loss and decided speculative advantages. Again, urge having vice president upon the ground. Effect here will be decidedly good. Resident attorney does not carry same prestige and weight. This goes through embassy by code. Answer same way. See cable and possibilities. Rolf Marsh, Francis, American Ambassador. Note, entire message in green cipher, telegraph room. A loaf in the cable was Olaf Ashberg, a Swedish banker and head of the Nya Banken in Stockholm. Ashberg had been in New York in 1915 conferring with the Morgan firm on these Russian loans. Now, in 1916, he was in Petrograd with Rolf Marsh of Guarantee Trust and Samuel McRoberts and Rich of National City Bank, City and Cable, arranging loans for a Morgan Rockefeller consortium. The following year, Ashberg, as well as we shall see later, would be known as the Bolshevik banker, and his own memoirs reproduce evidence of his right to the title. The State Department files also contain a series of cables between Ambassador Francis, Acting Secretary Frank Polk, and Secretary of State Robert Lansing concerning the legality and propriety of transmitting National City Bank and Guarantee Trust cables at public expense. On May 25, 1916, Ambassador Francis cabled Washington as follows and referred to the two previous cables. My telegram 563 and 565, May 24th, are sent for local representatives of institutions addressed in the hope of consummating loan which would largely increase international trade and greatly benefit diplomatic relations. Prospect for success promising. Petrograd representatives consider terms submitted very satisfactory, but fear such representations to their institutions would prevent consummation loan if government here acquainted these proposals. Francis, American Ambassador. The basic reason cited by Francis for facilitating the cables is, quote, the hope of consummating loan, which would largely increase international trade, unquote. Transmission of commercial messages using State Department facilities had been prohibited, and on June 1st, 1916, Polk cabled Francis, 842. In view of the Department's regulation contained in its circular telegraphic instruction of March 15th, discontinuance of forwarding commercial messages, 1915, please explain what messages in your 563, 565, and 575 should be communicated. Hereafter, please follow closely Department's instructions. Acting Polk. Then on June 8, 1916, Secretary of State Lansing expanded their prohibition and clearly stated that proposed loans were illegal. 860, your 563, 565, May 24th, and 569, May 25, 1 p.m. Before delivering messages to Vanderlip and Guarantee Trust Company, I must inquire whether they refer to Russian government loans of any description. If they do, I regret that the department cannot be a party to their transmission, as such action would submit it to justifiable criticism because of participation by this government in loan transaction by a belligerent for the purpose of carrying on its hostile operations. Such participation is contrary to the accepted rule of international law, that neutral governments should not lend their assistance to the raising of war loans by belligerents. The last line of the Lansing cable as written was not transmitted to Petrograd. The line read, quote, "Cannot arrangements be made to send these messages through Russian channels?" Unquote. How can we assess these cables and the parties involved? Clearly, the Morgan Rockefeller interests were not interested in abiding by international law. There is obvious intent in these cables to supply loans to belligerents. There was no hesitation on the part of these firms to use State Department facilities for their negotiations. Further, in spite of protests, the State Department allowed the messages to go through. Finally, and most interesting for subsequent events, Olof Aschberg, the Swedish banker, was a prominent participant and intermediary in the negotiations on behalf of Guarantee Trust. Let us therefore take a closer look at Olof Aschberg. Olof Aschberg in New York, 1916. Olof Aschberg, the Bolshevik banker, or Bankier der Revolution, as he has been called in the German press, was owner of the Nya Banken, founded in 1912 in Stockholm. His co-directors included prominent members of Swedish cooperatives and Swedish socialists, including G.W. Dahl, K.G. Rosling, and C. Gerhard Magnusson. In 1918, Nya Banken was placed on the Allied blacklist for its financial operations in behalf of Germany. In response to the blacklisting, Nya Banken changed its name to Svensk Ekonomibolaget. The bank remained under the control of Aschberg and was mainly owned by him. The bank's London agent was the British Bank of North Commerce, whose chairman was Earl Grey, former associate of Cecil Rhodes. Others in Aschberg's interesting circle of business associates included Krassin, who was until the Bolshevik Revolution, when he changed color to emerge as a leading Bolshevik, Russian manager of Siemens Schuckert in Petrograd. Karl Fustenberg, Minister of Finance in the first Bolshevik government, and Max May, Vice President in charge of foreign operations for Guarantee Trust of New York. Olof Aschberg thought so highly of Max May that a photograph of May is included in Aschberg's book. In the summer of 1916, Olof Aschberg was in New York representing both Nya Banken and Pierre Bark, the Tsarist Minister of Finance. Aschberg's prime business in New York, according to the New York Times, August 4, 1916, was to negotiate a $50 million loan for Russia with an American banking syndicate headed by Stillman's National City Bank. This business was concluded on June 5, 1916. The results were a Russian credit of $50 million in New York at a bank charge of 7.5% annum, and a corresponding 150 million ruble credit for the NCB syndicate in Russia. The New York syndicate then turned around and issued 6.5% certificates in its own name in the U.S. market to the amount of $50 million. Thus, the NCB syndicate made a profit on the $50 million loan to Russia, floated it on the American market for another profit, and obtained 150 million ruble credit in Russia. During his New York visit on behalf of the Tsarist Russian government, Oxford made some prophetic comments concerning the future for America and Russia. Quote, "The opening for American capital and American initiative, with the awakening brought by the war, will be countrywide when the struggle is over. There are now many Americans in Petrograd, representatives of business firms, keeping in touch with the situation, and as soon as the change comes, a huge American trade with Russia should spring up." New York Times, August 4th, 1916. Olaf Oxford in the Bolshevik Revolution. While this Tsarist loan operation was being floated in New York, Naya Bankin and Olaf Oxford were funneling funds from the German government to Russian revolutionaries, who would eventually bring down the Kerensky Committee and establish the Bolshevik regime. The evidence for Olaf Oxford's intimate connection with financing the Bolshevik Revolution comes from several sources, some of greater value than others. The Naya Bankin and Olaf Oxford are prominently cited in the Sutton papers, see Chapter 3. However, George Keenan has systematically analyzed these papers and shown them to be forged, although they are probably based in part on authentic material. Other evidence originates that Colonel B.V. Nikitin, in charge of counterintelligence in the Kerensky government, and consists of 29 telegrams transmitted from Stockholm to Petrograd, and vice versa, regarding financing of the Bolsheviks. 3 of these telegrams refer to banks. Telegrams 10 and 11 refer to Naya Bankin, and telegram 14 refers to the Russian Asiatic Bank in Petrograd. Telegram 10 reads as follows: Gisa Fustenberg, Salzsobaden, funds very low, cannot assist if really urgent. Give 500 as last payment pencils huge loss. Original hopeless. Instruct Naya Bankin, cable further 100,000 Semensen. Telegram 11 reads: Kozlovsky Sergievskaya, 81. First letters received Naya Bankin, telegraphed cable who, Solomon offering local telegraphic agency refers to Brug, Savilovic, Avilov. Fustenberg was the intermediary between Parvis, Alexander I. Heffeland, and the German government. About these transformers, Michael Futrell concludes: It was discovered that during the last few months, she, Evgenia Sumensen, had received nearly 1 million rubles from Fustenberg through the Naya Bank in Stockholm, and that this money came from German sources. Telegram 14 of the Nikitin series reads: Furstenberg Solzhenitsyn, number 90, period 100,000 into Russia Asiatic Susumingitsa. The U.S. representative for Russia Asiatic was McGregor Grant Company at 120 Broadway, New York City, and the bank was financed by a guarantee trust in the U.S. and the Naya Bankin in Sweden. Another mention of the Naya Bankin is in the material The Charges Against the Bolsheviks, which was published in the Kerensky period. Particularly noteworthy in that material is a document signed by Gregory Alensky, a former member of the Second State Duma, in reference to monetary transfers to the Bolsheviks. The document, in part, reads as follows: In accordance with the information just received, these trusted persons in Stockholm were the Bolshevik Jacob Fustenberg, better known under the name of Hanecki, and Parvis, in Petrograd, the Bolshevik attorney, M.U. Kozlovsky, a woman relative of Hanecki, Sumensen, engaged in speculation together with Hanecki and others. Kozlovsky is the chief receiver of German money, which is transferred from Berlin through the Diskonto Gesellschaft to the Stockholm via Bank, and thence to the Siberian Bank in Petrograd. where his account at present has a balance of over 2 million rubles. The military censorship has unearthed an uninterrupted exchange of telegrams of a political and financial nature between the German agents and Bolshevik leaders. Stockholm to Petrograd. The Russian Provincial Government, 1917. Robert Browder, Alexander Krinsky. Stanford University Press, 1961. Further, there is in the State Department files a green cipher message from the U.S. Embassy in Christiania, named Oslo, 1925, Norway, dated February 21st, 1918, that reads, "Am informed that Bolshevik funds are deposited in Nya Banken, Stockholm. Legation Stockholm advised. Schmiedemann." Finally, Michael Futrell, who interviewed Olaf Aschberg just before his death, concludes that Bolshevik funds were indeed transferred from Germany through Nya Banken and Jacob Fustenberg in the guise of payment for goods shipped. According to Futrell, Aschberg confirmed to him that Fustenberg had a commercial business with Nya Banken and that Fustenberg had also sent funds to Petrograd. These statements are authenticated in Aschberg's memoirs. See page 70. In sum, Aschberg, through his Nya Banken, was undoubtedly a channel for funds used in the Bolshevik Revolution, and Guarantee Trust was indirectly linked through its association with Aschberg and its interest in McGregor Grant Co., New York agent of the Russia Asiatic Bank, another transfer vehicle. Nya Banken and Guarantee Trust joined Ruscom Bank. Several years later, in the fall of 1922, the Soviets formed the First International Bank. It was based on a syndicate that involved the former Russian private bankers and some new investment from German, Swedish, American, and British bankers. Known as the Ruscombank, Foreign Commercial Bank, or the Bank of Foreign Commerce, it was headed by Olaf Aschberg. Its board consisted of Tsarist private bankers, representatives of German, Swedish, and American banks, and, of course, representatives of the Soviet Union. The U.S. Stockholm legation reported to Washington on this question and noted, in a reference to Aschberg, that his reputation is poor. He was deferred to in document 54 of the Sicel documents, in dispatch number 138 of January 4th, 1921, from a legation in Copenhagen. The foreign banking consortium involved in the Ruscom Bank represented mainly British capital. It included Russo-Asiatic Consolidated Limited, which is one of the largest private creditors of Russia, and which granted $3 million by the Soviets to compensate for damage to its properties in the Soviet Union by nationalization. The British government itself had already purchased substantial interests in the Russian private banks, according to a State Department report. The British government is heavily invested in the consortium in question. The consortium was granted extensive concessions in Russia, and the bank had a share capital of 10 million gold rubles. A report in the Danish newspaper National Tentolande stated that, quote, possibilities have been created for cooperation with the Soviet government where this, by political negotiations, would have been impossible, unquote. In other words, as the newspaper goes on to say, the politicians had failed to achieve cooperation with the Soviets, but it may be taken for granted that the capitalistic exploitation of Russia is beginning to assume more definite forms. In early October 1922, Olaf Aschberg met in Berlin with Emil Wittenberg, director of the National Bank für Deutschland, and Steinman, head of the Russian State Bank. After discussions concerning German involvement in the Bank, the three bankers went to Stockholm and there met with Max May, vice president of the Guarantee Trust Company. Max May was then designated director of the foreign division of the Bank, in addition to Schlesinger, former head of Moscow Merchant Bank, Kalishkin, former head of the Junker Bank, and Ternovsky, former head of the Siberian Bank. The last bank had been partly purchased by the British government in 1918. Professor Gustav Cassel of Sweden agreed to act as advisor to Bank. Cassel was quoted in a Swedish newspaper, Svenska Dagbladet of October 17, 1922, as follows. That a bank has now been started in Russia to take care of purely banking matters is a great step forward. And it seems to me that this bank was established in order to do something to create a new economic life in Russia. What Russia needs is a bank to create internal and external commerce. If there is to be any business between Russia and other countries, there must be a bank to handle it. This step forward should be supported in every way by other countries, and when I was asked my advice, I stated that I was prepared to give it. I am not in favor of a negative policy and believe that every opportunity should be seized to help in a positive reconstruction. The great question is how to bring the Russian exchange back to normal. It is a complicated question and will necessitate thorough investigation. To solve this problem, I am naturally more than willing to take part in the work. To leave Russia to her own resources and to her own fate is folly. The former Siberian Bank building in Petrograd was used as the head office of the Bank, whose objectives were to raise short-term loans in foreign countries, to introduce foreign capital into the Soviet Union, and generally to facilitate Russian overseas trade. It opened on December 1st, 1922 in Moscow and employed about 300 persons. In Sweden, Bank was represented by the Svenska Ekonomiblad of Stockholm, Olof Aschberg's Nya Banken under a new name, and in Germany by the Guarantee und Credit Bank für den Osten of Berlin. In the United States, the bank was represented by the Guarantee Trust Company of New York. On opening the bank, Olaf Aschberg commented, "The new bank will look after the purchasing of machinery and raw material from England and the United States that will give guarantees for the completion of contracts." The question of purchases in Sweden has not yet arisen, but it is hoped that such will be the case later on. On joining Bank, Max May of Guarantee Trust made a similar statement. The United States, being a rich country with well-developed industries, does not need to import anything from foreign countries, but it is greatly interested in exporting its products to other countries and considers Russia the most suitable market for that purpose, taking into consideration the vast requirements of Russia in all lines of its economic life. November 18th, 1922. May stated that the Russia Commercial Bank was very important and that it would largely finance all lines of Russian industries. From the very beginning, the operations of the Bank were restricted by the Soviet foreign trade monopoly. The bank had difficulties in obtaining advances on Russian goods deposited abroad. Because they were transmitted in the name of Soviet trade delegations, a great deal of Bank funds were locked up in deposits with the Russian State Bank. Finally, in early 1924, The Russian Commercial Bank was fused with the Soviet Foreign Trade Commissariat, and Olaf Aschberg was dismissed from his position at the bank because, it was claimed in Moscow, he had misused bank funds. His original connection with the bank was because of his friendship with Maxim Litvinov. Through this association, so runs a State Department report, Olaf Aschberg had access to large sums of money for the purpose of meeting payments on goods ordered by Soviets in Europe. These sums apparently were placed in the Ekonomioblage, a private banking company owned by Mr. Aschberg. It is now alleged that a large portion of these funds were employed by Mr. Aschberg for making investments for his personal account, that he is now endeavoring to maintain his position in the bank through his possession of this money. According to my informant, Mr. Aschberg has not been the sole one to profit by his operations. With the Soviet funds, that has divided the gains with those who are responsible for his appointment in the Russian Commerce Bank, among them being Litvinov. Ruscombank then became Vnestorg, by which it is known today. We now have to retrace our steps and look at the activities of Aschberg's New York associate, Guarantee Trust Company, during World War I, to lay the foundation of examination of its role in the revolutionary era in Russia. Guarantee Trust Company, Guarantee Trust and German Espionage in the United States, 1914 through 1917. During World War I, Germany raised considerable funds in New York for espionage and covert operations in North America and South America. It is important to record the flow of these funds because it runs from the same firms, Guarantee Trust and American International Corporation, that were involved in the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath. Not to mention the fact, outlined in Chapter 3, that the German government also financed Lenin's revolutionary activities. A summary of the loans granted by American banks to German interests in World War I was given to the 1919 Overman Committee of the United States Senate by U.S. military intelligence. The summary was based on the deposition of Carl Hainen, who came to the United States in April 1915, to assist Dr. Albert with the commercial and financial affairs of the German government. Hainen's official work was the transportation of goods from the United States to Germany by way of Sweden, Switzerland, and Holland. In fact, he was up to his ears in covert operations. The major German loans raised in the United States between 1915 and 1918, according to Hainen, were as follows. The first loan of $400,000 was made about September 1914 by the investment bankers Kuhn, Loeb, and Co. Collateral of 25 million marks was deposited with the Max W. Warburg in Hamburg. The German affiliate of Kuhn, Loeb, and Co. Captain George V. Lester of U.S. military intelligence told the Senate that Hainen's reply to the question, "Why did you go to Kuhn, Loeb, and Co.?" was Kuhn, Loeb, and Co. were considered the natural bankers of the German government and the Reichsbank. The second loan of $1.3 million did not come directly from the United States, but was negotiated by John Simon, an agent of the Süddeutsche Diskonto-Gesellschaft, to secure funds for making shipments to Germany. The third loan was from the Chase National Bank and the Morgan Group in the amount of $3 million. The fourth loan was from the Mechanics and Metals National Bank in the amount of $1 million. These loans financed German espionage activities in the United States and Mexico. Some funds were traced to Summerfield, who was an advisor to von Rintelen, another German espionage agent, and who was later associated with Hjalmar Schacht and Emil Wittenberg. Summerfield was to purchase ammunition for use in Mexico. He had an account with the Guarantee Trust Company, and from this, payments were made to Western Cartridge Co. of Alton, Illinois, for ammunition that was shipped to El Paso for use in Mexico by Pancho Villa's bandits. About $400,000 was expended on ammunition, Mexican propaganda, and similar activities. The then German ambassador, Count von Bernstorff, has recounted his friendship with Adolf von Pavenstedt, a senior partner of Amsnick & Co., which was controlled and in November 1917 owned by American International Corporation. American International figures prominently in later chapters. Its board of directors contained the key names on Wall Street: Rockefeller, Kahn, Stillman, DuPont, Winthrop, etc. According to von Bernstorff, von Pavenstedt was, quote, intimately acquainted with all the members of the embassy, unquote. Von Bernstorff himself regarded von Pavenstedt as one of the most respected, if not the most respected, Imperial German in New York. Indeed, von Pavenstedt was, for many years, a chief paymaster of the German spy system in this country. In other words, there is no question that Amsnick & Co., controlled by American International Corporation, was intimately associated with the funding of German wartime espionage in the United States. To clinch von Bernstorff's last statement, there exists a photograph of a check in favor of Amsnick & Co., dated December 8, 1917, just 4 weeks after the start of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, signed von Papen, another German espionage operator, and having a counterfoil bearing the notation traveling expenses on von W. von Waddell. French Strothers, who published the photograph Fighting Germany's Spies, has stated that this check is evidence that von Papen became an accessory after the fact to a crime against American laws. It also makes Amsnick & Co. subject to a similar charge. Paul Bolo Pasha, yet another German espionage agent and a prominent French financier, formerly in the service of the Egyptian government, arrived in New York in March 1916 with a letter of introduction to von Pavenstedt. Through the latter, Bolo Pasha met Hugo Schmidt, director of the Deutsche Bank in Berlin, and its representative in the United States. One of Bolo Pasha's projects was to purchase foreign newspapers so as to slant their editorials in favor of Germany. Funds for this program were arranged in Berlin in the form of credit with Guarantee Trust Company, with the credit subsequently made available to Amsnick & Co. Adolf von Pavenstedt of Amsnick in turn made the funds available to Bolo Pasha. In other words, both Guarantee Trust Company and Amsnick & Co., a subsidiary of American International Corporation, were directly involved in the implementation of German espionage and other activities in the United States. Some links can be established from these firms to each of the major German operators in the United States: Dr. Albert, Karl Heynen, von Rinkelen, von Papen, Count Jacques Minotto, and Paul Bolo Pasha. In 1919, the Senate Overman Committee also established that Guarantee Trust had an active role in financing German World War I efforts in an unneutral manner. The testimony of the U.S. intelligence officer Becker makes this clear. In this mission, Hugo Schmidt of the Deutsche Bank was very largely assisted by certain American banking institutions. It was while we were neutral, but they acted to the detriment of their British interests, and I have considerable data on the activity of the Guarantee Trust Co. in that respect and would like to know whether the committee wishes me to go into it. Senator Nelson, that is a breach of the city bank, is it not? Mr. Banker, or Mr. Becker? No. Senator Overman, if it was in a missile, in a missile to British interests, it was unneutral, and I think you had better let it come out. Senator King, was it ordinary banking transaction? Mr. Becker, that would be a matter of opinion. It has to do with camouflaging exchange so as to make it appear to be neutral exchange, but it was really German exchange on London. As a result of these operations, in which the Guarantee Trust Co. mainly participated between August 1st, 1914, and the time America entered the war, the Deutsche Bank and its branches in South America succeeded in negotiating $4,670,000 of London exchange in wartime. Senator Overman, I think that is competent. What is really important is not so much that financial assistance was given to Germany, which was only illegal, as that directors of Guarantee Trust were financially assisting the Allies at the same time. In other words, Guarantee Trust was financing both sides of the conflict. This raises the question of morality. The Guarantee Trust, Minotto, Callot threads. This section is based on the following sources, as well as those cited elsewhere. Jean Bardot, Le Colonel Nicolai, Espion de Génie, Paris, Editions Siboney, Coup de Justice, Affaire Callot, Le Callot et Combé, Procédure Générale, Interrogation, Paris, 1919, pages 349 through 50, 937 through 46. Paul Vergon, L'Affaire Callot, Paris, 1918. Especially the chapter titled Marx de Mannerheim, Henri Gournot, Émilie Kahn, and Camille Lemercier, Études documentaires sur l'affaire Callot, pages 1012 through 15. Treason and Tragedy, an account of French war trials, London, Jonathan Cape, 1929. On October 25th, 1914, Guarantee Trust sent Jacques Minotto to South America to make a report on the political, financial, and commercial situation. As he did in London, Washington, and New York, so Minotto moved into the highest diplomatic and political circles here. One purpose of Minotto's mission in Latin America was to establish the mechanism by which Guarantee Trust could be used as an intermediary for the previously mentioned German fundraising on the London money market, which was then denied to Germany because of World War I. Minotto returned to the United States, renewed his association with Count von Bernstorff and Count Luxemburg, and subsequently, in 1916, attempted to obtain a position with U.S. Naval Intelligence. After this, he was arrested on charges of pro-German activities. When arrested, Menoto was working at the Chicago plant of his father-in-law, Louis Swift of Swift & Co., meat packers. Swift put up the security for the $50,000 bond required to free Menoto, who was represented by Henry Veeder, the Swift & Co. attorney. Louis Swift was himself arrested for pro-German activities at a larger date. As an interesting and not unimportant coincidence, Major Harold H. Swift, brother of Louis Swift, was a member of the William Boyce Thompson 1917 Red Cross mission to Petrograd. That is, one of the group of Wall Street lawyers and businessmen whose intimate connections with the Russian Revolution are to be described later. Helen Swift Nielsen, sister of Louis and Harold Swift, was later connected with the pro-communist Abraham Lincoln Center, Unity. This established a minor link between German banks, American banks, German espionage, and, as we shall see later, the Bolshevik Revolution. Joseph Collot was a famous, sometimes called notorious, French politician. He was also associated with Count Menoto in the latter's Latin America operations for Guarantee Trust, and was later implicated in the famous French espionage cases of 1919, which had Bolshevik connections. In 1911, Collot became Minister of Finance and later in the same year became Premier of France. Jean-Louis Mulvey became Under Secretary of State in the Collot government. Several years later, Madame Collot murdered Gaston Calmet, editor of the prominent Paris newspaper Figaro. The prosecution charged that Madame Collot murdered Calmet to prevent the publication of certain compromising documents. This affair resulted in the departure of Collot and his wife from France. The couple went to Latin America and there met with Count Menoto, the agent of the Guarantee Trust Company, who was in Latin America to establish intermediaries for German finance. Count Menoto was socially connected with the Collot couple in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, in Montevideo, Uruguay, and Buenos Aires, Argentina. In other words, Count Menoto was a constant companion of the Collot couple while they were in Latin America. On returning to France, Collot and his wife stayed at Biarritz as guests of Paul Bolo Pasha, who was, as we have seen, also a German espionage operator in the United States and France. Later, in July 1915, Count Menoto arrived in France from Italy, met with the Collot couple. The same year, the Collot couple also visited Bolo Pasha, again in Biarritz. In other words, in 1915 and 1916, the Collot established a continuing social relationship with Count Menoto and Bolo Pasha, both of whom were German espionage agents in the United States. Bolo Pasha's work in France was to gain influence for Germany in the Paris newspapers, Le Temps and Figaro. Bolo Pasha then went to New York, arriving February 24, 1916. Here he was to negotiate a loan of $2 million, and here he was associated with von Pavenstedt, the prominent German agent with Amsink & Co. Severance Johnson, in The Enemy Within, has connected Collot and Mulvey to the 1918 Board of French Bolshevik Revolution, and states that if the revolution had succeeded, Mulvey would have been the Trotsky of France had Collot been its Lenin. Collot and Mulvey formed a radical socialist party in France, using German funds, and were brought to trial for these subversive efforts. The court interrogated interrogatories in the 1919 French espionage trials introduced testimony concerning New York bankers and their relationships with these German espionage operators. They also set forth the links between Count Menotti and Callot, as well as the relationship of the Guarantee Trust Company to the Deutsche Bank and the cooperation between Hugo Schmidt of Deutsche Bank and Max May of Guarantee Trust Company. The French interrogatory, page 940, has the following extract from the New York deposition of Count Menotti, page 10, and retranslated from the French. Question: under whose orders were you at Guarantee Trust? Reply: under the orders of Mr. Max May. Question: he was a vice president? Answer: he was vice president and director of the Foreign Department. Later, in 1922, Max May became a director of the Soviet Roscom Bank and represented the interests of the Guarantee Trust in that bank. The French interrogatory establishes that Count Menotti, a German espionage agent, was in the employ of Guarantee Trust Company, that Max May was his superior officer, and that Max May was also closely associated with Bolshevik banker Olaf Aschberg. In brief, Max May of Guarantee Trust was linked to illegal fundraising and German espionage in the United States during World War I. He was linked indirectly to the Bolshevik Revolution and directly to the establishment of Roscom Bank, the first international bank in the Soviet Union. It is too early to attempt an explanation for this seemingly inconsistent, illegal, and sometimes immoral international activity. In general, there are two plausible explanations. The first, a relentless search for profits. Second, which agrees with the words of Otto, Kahn, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and of American International Corporation in the epigraph to this chapter, the realization of socialist aims which should and can be brought about by non-socialist means. Chapter 5. The American Red Cross Mission in Russia, 1917. Poor Mr. Billings believed he was in charge of a scientific mission for the relief of Russia. He was in reality nothing but a mask. The Red Cross complexion of the mission was nothing but a mask. Cornelius Keller, assistant to William Boyce Thompson, and George F. Keenan, Russia leaves the war. The Wall Street Project in Russia in 1917 used the Red Cross mission as its operational vehicle. Both Guarantee Trust and National City Bank had representatives in Russia at the time of the revolution. Frederick M. Korse of the National City Bank branch in Petrograd was attached to the American Red Cross mission, of which a great deal will be said later. Guarantee Trust was represented by Henry Crosby Emery. Emery was temporarily held by the Germans in 1918, and then moved on to represent Guarantee Trust in China. Up to about 1915, the most influential person in the American Red Cross National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., was Miss Mabel Boardman. An active, energetic promoter, Miss Boardman had been the moving force behind the Red Cross enterprise. Although its endowment came from the wealthy and prominent persons including J.P. Morgan, Miss H. Harriman, Cleveland H. Dodge, and Miss Russell Sage. The 1910 fundraising campaign for $2 million, for example, was successful only because it's supported by these wealthy residents of New York City. In fact, most of the money came from New York City. J.P. Morgan himself contributed $100,000, and 7 other contributors in New York City amassed $300,000. Only one person outside New York City contributed over $10,000. And that was William J. Boardman, Miss Boardman's father. Henry P. Davison was chairman of the 1910 New York Fundraising Committee and later became chairman of the War Council of the American Red Cross. In other words, in World War I, the Red Cross depended heavily on Wall Street, and specifically on the Morgan firm. The Red Cross was unable to cope with the demands of World War I, and in fact was taken over by these New York bankers. According to John Foster Dulé, these businessmen, quote, viewed the American Red Cross as a virtual arm of government. They envisaged making an incalculable contribution to the winning of the war, unquote. In so doing, they made a mockery of the Red Cross motto, neutrality and humanity. In exchange for raising funds, Wall Street asked for the Red Cross War Council, and on the recommendation of Cleveland H. In exchange for raising funds, Wall Street asked for the Red Cross War Council, and on the recommendation of Cleveland H. Dodge, one of Woodrow Wilson's financial backers, Henry P. Davison, a partner in J.P. Morgan Company, became chairman. The list of administrators of the Red Cross then began to take on the appearance of the New York Directory of Directors: John D. Ryan, president of Anaconda Copper Company; C. Frontispiece; George W. Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company; Grayson M.P. Murphy, vice president of the Guarantee Trust Company; and Ivy Lee, public relations expert for the Rockefellers. Harry Hopkins, later to achieve fame under President Roosevelt, became assistant to the general manager of the Red Cross in Washington, D.C. The question of a Red Cross mission to Russia came before the third meeting of this reconstructed War Council, which was held in the Red Cross building, Washington, D.C., on Friday, May 29, 1917. At 11 a.m., Chairman Davison was deputed to explore the idea with Alexander Legay of the International Harvester Company. Subsequently, International Harvester, which had considerable interests in Russia, provided $200,000 to assist financing the Russian mission. At a later meeting, it was made known that William Boyce Thompson, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had offered to pay the entire expense of the commission. This offer was accepted in a telegram. Your desire to pay expenses of commission to Russia is very much appreciated from our point of view. Very important. The members of the mission received no pay. All expenses were paid by William Boyce Thompson, and the $200,000 from the International Harvester was apparently used in Russia for political subsidies. We know from the files of the U.S. Embassy in Petrograd that the U.S. Red Cross gave 4,000 rubles to Prince Lvov, president of the Council of Ministers, for relief of revolutionists, and $10,000 rubles in two payments to Kerensky for relief of political refugees. American Red Cross mission to Russia, 1917. In August 1917, the Russian Red Cross mission to Russia had only a nominal relationship with the American Red Cross. It must truly have been the most unusual Red Cross mission in history. All expenses, including those of the uniforms, the members were all colonels, majors, captains, or lieutenants, were paid out of the pocket of William Boyce Thompson. One contemporary observer dubbed the all-officer group an Haitian army. The American Red Cross delegation, about 40 colonels, majors, captains, and lieutenants, arrived yesterday. It is headed by Colonel Dr. Billings of Chicago. It includes Colonel William B. Thompson and many doctors and civilians, all with military titles. We dubbed the outfit the Haitian Army because there were no privates. They have come to fill no clearly defined mission, as far as I can find out. In fact, Governor Francis told me some time ago that he had urged they not be allowed to come, as there were already too many missions from the various allies in Russia. Apparently, this commission imagined there was urgent calls for doctors and nurses in Russia. As a matter of fact, there is at present a surplus of medical talent and nurses, native. and foreign in the country, and many half-empty hospitals in the large cities. Gibbs' Diary, August 9, 1917. State Historical Society of Wisconsin. The mission actually comprised only 24, not 40, having military rank from lieutenant colonel down to lieutenant, and was supplemented by 3 orderlies, 2 motion picture photographers, and 2 interpreters without rank. Only 5 out of 24 were doctors. In addition, there were 2 medical researchers. The mission arrived by train in Petrograd via Siberia in August 1917. The 5 doctors and orderlies stayed 1 month, returning to the United States on September 11th. Dr. Frank Billings, nominal head of the mission and professor of medicine at the United States of Chicago, was reported to be disgusted with the overtly political activities of the majority of the mission. The other medical men were William S. Thayer, professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University, D.J. McCarthy, fellow of Phipps Institute for Study and Prevention of Tuberculosis at Philadelphia, Henry C. Sherman, professor of food chemistry at Columbia University, C.E.A. Winslow, professor of bacteriology and hygiene at Yale Medical School, Wilbur E. Post, professor of medicine at Rush Medical College, Dr. Malcolm Grow of the Medical Officers Reserve Corps of the United States Army, and Orrin Reitman, professor of clinical medicine, New York Polyclinic Hospital. George C. Whipple was listed as professor of sanitary engineering at Harvard University, but in fact was partner of the New York firm of Hazen, Whipple, and Fuller, engineering consultants. This is significant because Malcolm Pierney, of whom more later, was listed as assistant sanitary engineer and employed as engineer by Hazen, Whipple, and Fuller. The majority of the mission, as seen from the table, was made up of lawyers, financiers, and their assistants from the New York financial district. The mission was financed by William B. Thompson, described in the official Red Cross circular as, quote, Commissioner and Business Manager, Director, United States Federal Bank of New York. Thompson brought along Cornelius Keller, described as an attaché to the mission but actually secretary to Thompson, with the same address, 14 Wall Street, New York City. Publicity for the mission was handled by Henry S. Brown of the same address. Thomas Day Thatcher was an attorney with Simpson, Thatcher and Bartlett, a firm founded by his father, Thomas Thatcher, in 1884, and prominently involved in railroad reorganization and mergers. Thomas Jr. first worked for the family firm, became assistant U.S. attorney under Henry L. Stimson, and returned to the family firm in 1909. The young Thatcher was a close friend of Felix Frankfurter and later became assistant to Raymond Robbins, also on the Red Cross mission. In 1925, he was appointed district judge under President Coolidge, became Solicitor General under Herbert Hoover, and was a director of the William Boyce Thompson Institute. Allen Wardwell, also a deputy commissioner and secretary to the chairman, was a lawyer with the law firm of Stetson, Jennings, and Russell of 15 Broad Street, New York City, and H.B. Redfield was law secretary to Wardwell. Major Wardwell was the son of William Thompson Wardwell, longtime treasurer of Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York. The elder Wardwell was one of the signers of the famous Standard Oil Trust Agreement. a member of the committee to organize Red Cross activities in the Spanish-American War, and a director of the Greenwich Savings Bank. His son, Alan, was a director not only of the Greenwich Savings Bank, but also the Bank of New York and Trust Co., and the Georgian Manganese Company, along with W. Averill Harriman, a director of Guarantee Trust. In 1917, Alan Wardwell was affiliated with Stetson, Jennings, and Russell, and later joined Davis, Polk, and Wardwell, Gardner, and Reed. Frank L. Polk was acting Secretary of State during the Bolshevik Revolution period. The Senate Overman Committee noted that Wardwell was favorable to the Soviet regime, although Poole, the State Department official on the spot, noted that Major Wardwell has all of the Americans the wildest personal knowledge of the terror. In the 1920s, Wardwell became active with the Russian-American Chamber of Commerce in promoting Soviet trade objectives. The treasurer of the mission was James W. Andrews, auditor of the Leggett and Myers Tobacco Company of St. Louis. Robert Barr, another member, was listed as a deputy commissioner. He was a vice president of Chase Securities Company, 120 Broadway, and of the Chase National Bank. Listed as being in charge of advertising was William Cochrane of 61 Broadway, New York City. Raymond Robbins, a binding promoter, was included as deputy commissioner and described as a social economist. Finally, the mission included 2 members of Swift & Co. of Union Stockyards, Chicago. The Swifts have been previously mentioned as being connected with German espionage in the United States during World War I. Harold H. Swift, Deputy Commissioner, was assistant to the Vice President of Swift & Co. William G. Nicholson was also with Swift & Co., Union Stockyards. 2 persons were unofficially added to the mission after it arrived in Petrograd. Frederick M. Corse, representative of the National City Bank of Petrograd, and Herbert A. Magnuson, who was very highly recommended by John W. Finch, a confidential agent in China of Colonel William B. Thompson. The Perney Papers, deposited at the Hoover Institution, contained primary material on the mission. Malcolm Perney was an engineer employed by the firm of Hazen, Whipple, and Fuller, consulting engineers of 42th Street, New York City. Perney was a member of the mission, listed on a manifest as an assistant sanitary engineer. George C. Whipple, a partner in the firm, was also included in the group. The Perney Papers include an original telegram from William B. Thompson, inviting assistant sanitary engineer Perney to meet with him, and Henry P. Davidson, chairman of the Red Cross War Council and partner in the J.P. Morgan firm, before leaving for Russia. The telegram reads as follows: Western Union Telegram, New York, June 21, 1917. To Malcolm Perney, I should very much like to have you dine with me at the Metropolitan Club, 16th Street and 5th Avenue, New York City, at 8 o'clock tomorrow, Friday evening, to meet Mr. H.P. Davidson, W.B. Thompson, 14 Wall Street. The files do not elucidate why Morgan, partner Davison, and Thompson, director of the Federal Reserve Bank, 2 of the most prominent financial men in New York, wished to have dinner with an assistant sanitary engineer about to leave for Russia. Neither do the files explain why Davidson was subsequently unable to meet Dr. Billings in the commission itself, nor why it was necessary to advise Perney of his inability to do so. But we may surmise that the official cover of the mission, Red Cross activities, was of significantly less interest than the Thompson-Perney activities, whatever they may have been. We do know that Davidson wrote to Dr. Billings on June 25, 1917. Dear Dr. Billings, it is a disappointment to me and to my associates on the War Council not have been able to meet in a body the members of your commission. A copy of this letter was also mailed to Assistant Sanitary Engineer Pierney, with a personal letter from Morgan banker Henry P. Davison, which read, My dear Mr. Pierney, you will, I am sure, entirely understand the reason for the letter to Dr. Billings, copy of which is enclosed, and accept it in the spirit in which it is sent. The purpose of Davidson's letter to Dr. Billings was to apologize to the Commission and Billings for being unable to meet with them. We may be justified in supposing that some deep arrangements were made by Davison and Pierney concerning the activities of the mission in Russia, and that these arrangements were known to Thompson. The probable nature of these activities will be described later. The American Red Cross mission, or perhaps we should call it the Wall Street mission to Russia, also employed 3 Russian and English interpreters: Captain Eloisky, a Russian Bolshevik, Boris Reinstein, a Russian-American, later secretary to Lenin, and the head of Karl Radek's Bureau of International Revolutionary Propaganda, which also employed John Reed and Albert Rise Williams, and Alexander Gutenberg, alias Berg, real name Michael Grusenberg, who was brother of Zorin, a Bolshevik minister. Gutenberg was also the chief Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia. He later became a confidential assistant to Floyd Udlum of Atlas Corporation in the United States, as well as an advisor to Reeve Schley, a vice president of the Chase Bank. It should be asked in passing, how useful were the translations supplied by these interpreters? On September 13, 1918, H.A. Doolittle, American Vice Consul at Stockholm, reported to the Secretary of State on a conversation with Captain Olejowski, who was a close personal friend of Colonel Robbins of the Red Cross mission, concerning a meeting of the Merman Soviet and the Allies. The question of inviting the Allies to land at Merman was under discussion at the Soviet, with Major Thatcher of the Red Cross mission acting for the Allies. Olejowski interpreted Thatcher's views for the Soviet. Olejowski spoke at some length in Russian, supposedly translating for Thatcher, but in reality for Trotsky, to the effect that the United States would never permit such a landing to occur, in urging the speedy recognition of the Soviets and their politics. Apparently, Thatcher suspected he was being mistranslated and expressed his indignation. However, Olejowski immediately telegraphed the substance to Bolshevik headquarters, and through their press bureau, had it appear in all the papers as emanating from the remarks of Mayor Thatcher, and as the general opinion of all truly accredited American representatives. Olejowski recounted to Medine Summers, U.S. Consul General in Moscow, several instances where he and Raymond Robbins of the Red Cross mission had manipulated the Bolshevik press, especially in regard to the recall of the ambassador, Mr. Francis. He admitted that they had not been scrupulous, but had acted according to their ideas of right, regardless of how they might have conflicted with the politics of the accredited American representatives. This then was the American Red Cross mission to Russia in 1917. American Red Cross mission to Romania. In 1917, the American Red Cross also sent a medical assistance mission to Romania, then fighting the Central Powers as an ally of Russia. A comparison of the American Red Cross mission to Russia with that sent to Romania suggests that the Red Cross mission based in Petrograd had very little official connection with the Red Cross, and even less connection with medical assistance, whereas the Red Cross mission to Romania valiantly upheld the Red Cross twin principles of humanity and neutrality. The Red Cross mission to Petrograd flagrantly abused both. The American Red Cross mission to Romania left the United States in July 1917 and located itself at Jassy. The mission consisted of 30 persons under Chairman Henry W. Anderson, a lawyer from Virginia. Of the 30, 16 were either doctors or surgeons. By comparison, out of the 29 individuals with the Red Cross mission to Russia, only 3 were doctors, although another 4 members were from universities and specialized in medically related fields. At the most, 7 could be classified as doctors with the mission to Russia, compared with 16 with the mission to Romania. There was about the same number of orderlies and nurses with both missions. The significant comparison, however, is that the Romanian mission had only 2 lawyers. One, however, is that the Romanian mission, 1 treasurer and 1 engineer. The Russian mission had 15 lawyers and businessmen. None of the Romanian missions had lawyers or doctors came from anywhere near the New York area, but all except 1, an observer from the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., of the lawyers and businessmen with the Russian mission came from that area, which is to say that more than half of the total of the Russian mission came from the New York financial district. In other words, the relative composition of these missions confirms that the mission to Romania had a legitimate purpose, to practice medicine, while the Russian mission had a non-medical and strictly political objective. From its personnel, it could be classified as a commercial or financial mission, but from its actions, it was a subversive political action group. The Red Cross mission to Romania remained at its post in Jassy for the remainder of 1917 and into 1918. The medical staff of the American Red Cross mission to Russia, 7 doctors, quit in disgust in August 1917, protested the political activities of Colonel Thompson, and returned to the United States. Consequently, in September 1917, when the Russian mission appealed to Petrograd for American doctors and nurses to help out the near-crisis conditions in Jassy, there were no American doctors or nurses in Russia available to go to Romania. Whereas the bulk of the mission in Russia occupied its time in internal political maneuvering. The mission in Romania threw itself into relief work as soon as it arrived. On September 17, 1917, a confidential cable from Henry W. Anderson, chairman of the Romanian mission, to the American ambassador Francis in Petrograd, requested immediate and urgent help in the form of $5 million to meet an impending catastrophe in Romania. Then followed a series of letters, cables, and communications from Anderson to Francis appealing, unsuccessfully, for help. On September 28, 1917, Volpica, American minister in Romania, cabled Francis at length for relay to Washington, and repeated Anderson's analysis of the Romanian crisis and the danger of the epidemics, and worse, as winter closed in. Considerable money and heroic measures required to prevent far-reaching disaster. Useless try-handle situation without someone with authority and access to government, with proper organization to look after transport, receive, and distribute supplies. The hands of Volpica and Anderson were tied as all Romanian supplies and financial transactions were handled by the Red Cross mission in Petrograd, and Thompson and his staff of 15 Wall Street lawyers and businessmen apparently had matters of greater concern than Romanian Red Cross affairs. There is no indication, in the Petrograd Embassy files at the United States State Department that Thompson, Robbins, or Thatcher concerned himself at any time in 1917 or 1918 with the urgent situation in Romania. Communications from Romania went to Ambassador Francis or to one of his embassy staff, and occasionally through the consul in Moscow. By October 1917, the Romanian situation reached the crisis point. Volpica cabled Davison in New York via Petrograd on October 5th. Most urgent problem here. Disastrous effect feared. Could you possibly arrange special shipment? Must rush, or too late. Then on November 5th, Anderson cabled to Petrograd Embassy saying that delays in sending help had already cost several thousand lives. On November 13th, Anderson cabled Ambassador Francis concerning Thompson's lack of interest in Romanian conditions. Requested Thompson furnish details all shipments as received, but have not obtained same. Also requested him keep me posted as to transport conditions, but received very little information. Anderson then requested that Ambassador Francis intercede on his behalf in order to have funds for the Romanian Red Cross handled in a separate account in London, directly under Anderson, and removed from the control of Thompson's mission. Thompson in Kerensky's Russia. What then was the Red Cross mission doing? Thompson certainly acquired a reputation for opulent living in Petrograd, but apparently he undertook only two major projects in Kerensky's Russia: support for an American propaganda program and support for the Russian Liberty Loan. Soon after arriving in Russia, Thompson met with Madame Breshkovskaya and David Soskais, Kerensky's secretary, and agreed to contribute $2 million to a committee of popular education so that it could, quote, have its own press and engage a staff of lecturers with cinematograph illustrations. This was for the propaganda purpose of urging Russia to continue in the war against Germany. According to Soskais, a packet of 50,000 rubles was given to the Breshkovskaya with the statement, "This is for you to expend according to your best judgment." A further 2,100,000 rubles was deposited into a current bank account. A letter from J.P. Morgan to the State Department confirms that Morgan cabled 425,000 rubles to Thompson at his request for the Russian Liberty Loan. J.P. also conveyed the interest of the Morgan firm regarding, quote, the wisdom of making an individual subscription through Mr. Thompson, unquote, to the Russian Liberty Loan. The sums were transmitted through the National Security Branch in Petrograd. Thompson gives the Bolsheviks $1 million. Of greater historical significance, however, was the assistance given to the Bolsheviks first by Thompson, then, after December 4th, 1917, by Raymond Robbins. Thompson's contribution to the Bolshevik cause was recorded in the contemporary American press. The Washington Post, February 2nd, 1918, carried the following paragraphs. Give Bolsheviki $1 million. W.B. Thompson, Red Cross donor, believes party misrepresented. New York, February 2nd, 1918. William B. Thompson, who was in Petrograd from July until November last, has made a personal contribution of $1 million to the Bolsheviki for the purpose of spreading their doctrine in Germany and Austria. Mr. Thompson had an opportunity to study Russian conditions as head of the American Red Cross mission, expenses of which also were largely defrayed by his personal contributions. He believes that the Bolsheviki constitute the greatest power against pro-Germanism in Russia, and that their propaganda had been undermining the militarist regimes of the general empires. Mr. Thompson deprecates American criticism of the Bolsheviki. Depreciates. He believes they have been misrepresented and has made the financial contribution to the cause in the belief that it will be money well spent for the future of Russia, as well as for the Allied cause. Hermann Hagedorn's biography, The Magnate, William Boyce Thompson in his time, 1869 through 1930, reproduces a photograph of a cablegram from J.P. Morgan Chase in New York to W.B. Thompson, care American Red Cross, Hotel Europe, Petrograd. The cable is date stamped, showing it was received at Petrograd, 8 December 1917. New York, your cable second received. We have paid National City Bank $1 million. As instructed, Morgan. The National City Bank branch in Petrograd had been exempted from the Bolshevik nationalization decree. The only foreign or domestic Russian bank to have been so exempted. Hagedorn says that this $1 million paid into Thompson's NCB account was used for political purposes. Socialist mining promoter Raymond Robbins. William B. Thompson left Russia in early December 1917 to return home. He traveled via London, where, in company with Thomas Lamont of the J.P. Morgan firm, he visited Prime Minister Lloyd George, an episode we pick up in the next chapter. His deputy, Raymond Robbins, was left in charge of the Red Cross mission to Russia. The general impression that Colonel Robbins presented in the subsequent months was not overlooked by the press. In the words of the Russian newspaper, Rusko Slovo, Robbins, on the one hand, represents American labor, and on the other hand, American capital, which is endeavoring through the Soviets to gain the Russian markets. Raymond Robbins started life as a manager of a Florida phosphate company commissary. From this base, he developed a kaolin deposit, then prospected Texas and the Indian Territories in the late 19th century. Moving north to Alaska, Robbins made a fortune in the Klondike Gold Rush. Then, for no observable reason, he switched to socialism and the Reform movement. By 1912, he was an active member of Roosevelt's Progressive Party. He joined the 1917 American Red Cross mission to Russia as a social economist. There is considerable evidence, including Robbins' own statements, that his reformist social good appeals were little more than covers for the acquisition of further power and wealth, reminiscent of Frederick Howe's suggestion in Confessions of a Monopolist. For example, in February 1918, Arthur Bullard was in Petrograd with the U.S. Committee on Public Information and engaging in writing a long memorandum for Colonel Edward House. This memorandum was given to Robbins by Bullard for comments and criticism before transmission to House in Washington, D.C. Robbins's very unsocialistic and imperialistic comments were to the effect that the manuscript was uncommonly discriminating, far-seeing, and well done, but that he had one or two reservations. In particular, that recognition of the Bolsheviks was long overdue, that it should have been effected immediately, and that had the U.S. so recognized the Bolsheviks, I believe we now be in control of the surplus resources of Russia and have control officers at all points on the frontier. This desire to gain control of the surplus resources of Russia was also obvious to Russians. Does this sound like a social reformer in the American Red Cross or a Wall Street mining promoter engaged in the practical exercise of imperialism? In any event, Robbins made no bones about his support for the Bolshevists. Barely 3 weeks after the Bolshevik phase of the revolution started, Robbins cabled Henry Davidson, at Red Cross headquarters. Please urge upon the President the necessity of our continued intercourse with the Bolshevik government. Interestingly, this cable was in reply to a cable instructing Robbins that the President desires the withholding of direct communications by representatives in the United States with the Bolshevik government. Petrograd Embassy, Red Cross file. Several State Department reports complained about the partisan nature of Robbins' activities. For example, on March 27, 1919, Harris, the American consul at Vladivostok, commented on the long conversation he had had with Robbins and protested gross inaccuracies in the latter's reports. Harris wrote, "Robbins stated to me that no German and Austrian prisoners of war had joined the Bolshevik army up to May 1918. Robbins knew that statement was absolutely false." Harris then proceeded to provide the details of evidence available to Robbins. Harris concluded, Robbins deliberately misstated facts concerning Russia at that time, and he had been doing it ever since. On returning to the United States in 1918, Robbins continued his efforts in behalf of the Bolsheviks. When the files of the Soviet Bureau were seized by the Lust Committee, it was found that Robbins had had considerable correspondence with Ludwig Martins and other members of the Bureau. One of the more interesting documents seized was a letter from Santeri Nurativera, alias Alexander Neinberg, the first Soviet representative in the United States, to Comrade Kahan, editor of the New York Daily Forward. The letter called on the party faithful to prepare the way for Raymond Robbins. July 6, 1918. Dear Comrade Kahan, it is of the utmost importance that the socialist press set up a clamor immediately that Colonel Raymond Robbins, who has just returned from Russia at the head of the Red Cross mission, should be heard from in a public report to the American people. The armed intervention danger has greatly increased. The reactionists are using the Czech-Slovak adventure to bring about invasion. Robbins has all the facts about this and about the situation in Russia generally. He takes our point of view. I'm enclosing a copy of Call editorial which shows a general line of argument. Also some facts about Czechoslovaks. Fraternally, Santeri Nurativa. The International Red Cross and Revolution. Unknown to its administrators, the Red Cross has been used from time to time as a vehicle or cover for revolutionary activities. The use or Red Cross makings for unauthorized purposes is not uncommon. When Tsar Nicholas was moved from Petrograd to Tobolsk, allegedly for his safety, although this direction was towards danger rather than safety, the train carried Japanese Red Cross placards. The State Department files contain examples of revolutionary activity under cover of Red Cross activities. For example, a Russian Red Cross official, Cheglanovov, was arrested in Holland in 1919 for revolutionary acts. During the Hungarian Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, led by Bela Kun, Russian members of the Red Cross, or revolutionaries operating as members of the Russian Red Cross, were found in Vienna and Budapest. In 1919, the United States ambassador in London cabled Washington startling news. Though the British government he had learned that, quote, several Americans who had arrived in this country in the uniform of the Red Cross and who stated that they were Bolsheviks, were proceeding through France to Switzerland to spread Bolshevik propaganda. The ambassador noted that about 400 American Red Cross people had arrived in London in November and December 1918, and that number one quarter returned to the United States, and, quote, the remainder insisted on proceeding to France, unquote. There was a later report on January 15, 1918, to the effect that an editor of a labor newspaper in London had been approached on 3 different occasions by 3 different American Red Cross officials who offered to take commissions to Bolsheviks in Germany. The editor had suggested to the U.S. Embassy that it would watch American Red Cross personnel. The U.S. State Department took these reports seriously and Polk cabled for names, stating, "If true, I consider it of the greatest importance." To summarize, the picture we form of the 1917 American Red Cross mission to Russia is remote from one of neutral humanitarianism. The mission was in fact the mission of Wall Street financiers to influence and pave the way of control, through either Kerensky or the Bolshevik revolutionaries, of the Russian market and resources. No other explanation will explain the actions of the mission. However, neither Thompson nor Robbins was a Bolshevik, nor was either even a consistent socialist. The writer is inclined to the interpretation that the socialist appeals of each man were covers for more prosaic objectives. Each man was intent upon the commercial, that is, each sought to use the political process in Russia for personal financial ends. Whether the Russian people wanted the Bolsheviks was of no concern. Whether the Bolshevik regime would act against the United States, as it consistently did later, was of no concern. The single overwhelming objective was to gain political and economic influence with the new regime, whatever its ideology. If William Boyce Thompson had acted alone, then his directorship of the Federal Reserve Bank would be inconsequential. However, the fact his mission was dominated by representatives of Wall Street institutions raises a serious question. In effect, whether the mission was a planned, premeditated operation by Wall Street syndicate, this the reader will have to judge for him or herself as the rest of the story unfolds. Chapter 6: Consolidation and Export of the Revolution. Marx's great book, Das Kapital, is at once a monument of reasoning and a storehouse of facts. Lord Milner, member of the British War Cabinet 1917 and director of the London Joint Stock Bank. William Boyce Thompson is an unknown name in the 20th century history, yet Thompson played a crucial role in the Bolshevik Revolution. Indeed, if Thompson had not been in Russia in 1917, subsequent history might have followed a quite different course. Without the financial and, more important, the diplomatic and propaganda assistance given to Trotsky and Lenin by Thompson, Robbins, and their New York associates, the Bolsheviks may have well withered away and Russia evolved into a socialist but constitutional society. Who was William Boyce Thompson? Thompson was a promoter of mining stocks, one of the best in a high-risk business. Before World War I, he handled stock market operations for the Guggenheim copper interests. When the Guggenheims needed quick capital for a stock market struggle with John D. Rockefeller, it was Thompson who promoted Yukon Consolidated Goldfields before an unsuspected public to raise a $3.5 million war chest. Thompson was manager to the Kennecott Syndicate, another Guggenheim operation valued at $200 million. It was Guggenheim Exploration, on the other hand, that took up Thompson's options on the rich Nevada Consolidated Copper Company. About 3/4 of the original Guggenheim Exploration Company was controlled by the Guggenheim family, the Whitney family, who owned Metropolitan Magazine, which employed the Bolshevik John Reed and John Ryan. In 1916, the Guggenheim interests reorganized into the Guggenheim Brothers and brought in William C. Potter, who was formerly with Guggenheim's American Smelting and Refining Company, who was, in 1916, first vice president of Guarantee Trust. Extraordinary skill in raising capital for risky mining promotions earned Thompson a personal fortune and directorships in Inspiration Consolidated Copper Company, Nevada Consolidated Copper Company, and the Utah Copper Company, all major domestic copper producers. Copper is, of course, a major material in the manufacture of munitions. Thompson was also director of the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railroad, the Magma Arizona Railroad, and the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and of particular interest for this book. Thompson was, quote, one of the heaviest stockholders in the Chase National Bank, unquote. It was Albert H. Wiggin, president of the Chase Bank, who pushed Thompson for a post in the Federal Reserve System. And in 1914, Thompson became the first full-term director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important bank in the Federal Reserve System. By 1917, then, William Boyce Thompson was a financial operator of substantial means, demonstrated ability with a flair for promotion and implementation of capitalist projects, and with ready access to the centers of political and financial power. This was the same man who first supported Alexander Kerensky, and who then became an ardent supporter of the Bolsheviks, bequeathing a surviving symbol of his support, a laudatory pamphlet in Russian, Pravda o Rossi I Bolshevika. Before leaving Russia in early December 1917, Thompson handed over the American Red Cross mission to his deputy Raymond Robbins. Robbins then organized the Russian revolutionaries to implement the Thompson plan for spreading Bolshevik propaganda in Europe. A French government document confirms this. It appeared that Colonel Robbins was able to send a subversive mission of Russian Bolsheviks to Germany to start a revolution. This mission led to the abortive German Spartacist revolt of 1918. The overall plan has included schemas for dropping Bolshevik literature by airplane or for smuggling it across German lines. Thompson made preparations in late 1917 to leave Petrograd and sell the Bolshevik Revolution to governments in Europe and to the U.S. With this in mind, Thompson cabled Thomas W. Lamont, a partner in the Morgan firm, who was then in Paris with Colonel M. House. Lamont recorded the receipt of the cablegram in his biography. Just as the House mission was completing its discussions in Peru in December 1917, I received an arresting cable from my old school and business friend, William Boyce Thompson, who was then in Petrograd in charge of the American Red Cross mission. Lamont journeyed to London and met with Thompson, who had left Petrograd on December 5th, traveled via Bergen, Norway, and arrived in London on December 10th. The most important achievement of Thompson and Lamont in London was to convince the British War Cabinet, then decidedly anti-Bolshevik, that the Bolshevik regime had come to stay, and that British policy should cease to be anti-Bolshevik, should accept the new realities, and should support Lenin and Trotsky. Thompson and Lamont left London on December 18th and arrived in New York on December 25th, 1917. They attempted the same process of conversion in the United States. A consultation with Lloyd George. The secret British War Cabinet papers are now available and record the argument used by Thompson to sell the British government on a pro-Bolshevik policy. The Prime Minister of Great Britain was David Lloyd George. Lloyd George's private and political machinations rivaled those of a Tammany Hall politician. Yet in his lifetime, and for decades later, biographers were unable or unwilling to come to grips with them. In 1970, Donald McCormick's The Mask of Merlin lifted the veil of secrecy. McCormick shows that by 1917, David Lloyd George had bogged too deeply into the mesh of international armaments intrigues to be a free agent, and was beholden to Sir Basil Zaharoff, an international armaments dealer, whose considerable fortune was made by selling arms to both sides in several wars. Zaharoff wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power and, according to McCormick, was consulted on war policies by the Allied leaders. On more than one occasion, reports McCormick, Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau met in Zaharoff's Paris home. McCormick notes that Allied statesmen and leaders were obliged to consult him before planning any great attacks. British intelligence, according to McCormick, discovered documents which incriminated servants of the Crown as secret agents of Sir Basil Zaharoff with the knowledge of Lloyd George. In 1917, Zaharoff was linked to the Bolsheviks. He sought to divert munitions away from anti-Bolsheviks and had already intervened in behalf of the Bolshevik regime in both London and Paris. In late 1917, then, at the time Lamont and Thompson arrived in London, Prime Minister Lloyd George was indebted to powerful international armaments interests that were allied to the Bolsheviks and providing assistance to extend Bolshevik power in Russia. The British Prime Minister who met with William Thompson in 1917 was not then a free agent. Lord Milner was the power behind the scenes, and, as the epigraph to this chapter suggests, favorably inclined towards socialism and Karl Marx. The secret War Cabinet papers give the Prime Minister's account of conversation with Mr. Thompson, an American returned from Russia, and the report made by the Prime Minister to the War Cabinet after meeting from Thompson. The Cabinet paper reads as follows. The Prime Minister reported a conversation he had had with a Mr. Thompson, an American traveler and a man of considerable means, who had just returned from Russia and who had given a somewhat different impression of affairs in that country from what was generally believed. The gist of his remarks was to the effect that the revolution had come to stay, that the Allies had not shown themselves sufficiently sympathetic with the revolution, and that Trotsky and Lenin were not in German pay, the latter being a fairly distinguished professor. Mr. Thompson added that he had considered the Allies should conduct in Russia an active propaganda carried out by some form of Allied council, composed of men specially selected for the purpose. Further, that on the whole he considered having regard to the character of the de facto Russian government. The several allied governments were not suitably represented in Petrograd. In Mr. Thompson's opinion, it was necessary for the Allies to realize that the Russian army and people were out of the war, and that the Allies would have to choose between Russia as the friendly or hostile neutral. The question was discussed as to whether the Allies ought not to change their policy in regard to the de facto Russian government, the Bolsheviks being stated by Mr. Thompson to be anti-German. In this connection, Lord Robert Cecil drew attention to the conditions of the armistice between the German and Russian armies, which provided inter alia for trading between the two countries and for the establishment of a purchasing commission in Odessa, the whole arrangement being obviously dictated by the Germans. Lord Robert Cecil expressed the view that the Germans would endeavor to continue the armistice until the Russian army had melted away. Sir Edward Carson read a communication signed by M. Trotsky, which had been sent to him by a British subject, the manager of the Russian branch of the Bohol Motor Company, who had just returned from Russia. This report indicated M. Trotsky's policy was, ostensibly at any rate, one of hostility to the organization of civilized society rather than pro-German. On the other hand, it was suggested that an assumed attitude of this kind was by no means inconsistent with Trotsky's being a German agent, whose object was to ruin Russia in order that Germany might do what she desired in that country. After hearing Lloyd George's report and supporting arguments, the War Cabinet decided to go along with Thompson and the Bolsheviks. Milner had a former British consul in Russia, Bruce Lockhart, ready and waiting in the wings. Lockhart was briefed and sent to Russia with instructions to work informally with the Soviets. The thoroughness of Thompson's work in London and the pressure he was able to bring to bear on the situation are suggested by subsequent reports coming into the hands of the War Cabinet from authentic sources. The reports provide a quite different view of Trotsky and the Bolsheviks from that presented by Thompson, and yet they were ignored by the cabinet. In April 1918, General Jan Smuts reported to the War Cabinet his talk with General Kneippel, the head of the French military mission, who had just returned from Russia. Trotsky was a consummate scoundrel who may not be pro-German, but is thoroughly pro-Trotsky and pro-revolutionary, and cannot in any way be trusted. His influence is shown by the way he has come to dominate Lockhart, Robbins, and the French representative. He, Kneippel, counsels great prudence in dealing with Trotsky, who he admits is only real able man in Russia. Several months later, Thomas D. Thatcher, Wall Street lawyer and another member of the American Red Cross mission to Russia, was in London. On April 13, 1918, Thatcher wrote to the American ambassador in London to the effect that he had received a request from H.P. Davison, a Morgan partner, to confer with Lord Northcliffe concerning the situation in Russia, and then to go to Paris for other conferences. Lord Northcliffe was ill, and Thatcher left with yet another Morgan partner, Dwight W. Morrow, a memorandum to be submitted to Northcliffe on his return to London. This memorandum was not only made explicit suggestions about Russian policy that supported Thompson's position, but even stated that, quote, the fullest assistance should be given to the Soviet government in its efforts to organize a voluntary revolutionary army, unquote. The four main proposals in this Thatcher report are, quote, first of all, the Allies should discourage Japanese intervention in Siberia. In the second place, The fullest assistance should be given to the Soviet government in its efforts to organize a volunteer revolutionary army. Thirdly, the Allied governments should give their moral support to the Russian people in their efforts to work out their own political systems free from the domination of any foreign power. Fourthly, until the time when open conflict shall result between the German government and the Soviet government of Russia, there will be opportunity for peaceful commercial penetration by German agencies in Russia. So long as there is no open break, it will probably be impossible to entirely prevent such commerce. Steps should there be taken to impede, so far as possible, the transport of grain and raw materials to Germany from Russia. Thompson's intentions and objectives. Why would a prominent Wall Street financier and director of the Federal Reserve Bank want to organize and assist the Bolshevik revolutionaries? Why would not one but several Morgan partners working in concert want to encourage the formation of a Soviet, quote, volunteer revolutionary army, unquote, an army supposedly dedicated to the overthrow of Wall Street, including Thompson, Thomas Lamont, Dwight Morrell, the Morgan firm, and all of their associates? Thompson, at least, was straightforward about his objectives in Russia. He wanted to keep Russia at war with Germany, yet he argued before the British War Cabinet that Russia was out of the war anyway, and to retain Russia as a market for post-war American enterprise. The December 1917 Thompson Memorandum to Lloyd George describes these aims. The memorandum begins, "The Russian situation is lost, and Russia lies entirely open to oppose German exploitation," and concludes, "I believe that intelligence and courageous work will still prevent Germany from occupying the field to itself, and thus exploiting Russia at the expense of the Allies. Consequently, it was German commercial and industrial exploitation of Russia that Thompson feared. That is also reflected in that Thatcher Memorandum, and that brought Thompson and his New York friends into an alliance with the Bolsheviks. Moreover, this interpretation is reflected in the quasi-jocular statement made by Raymond Robbins, Thompson's deputy, to Bruce Lockhart, the British agent. You will hear it said that I am the representative of Wall Street, that I am the servant of William B. Thompson to get Altai copper for him, that I have already got 500,000 acres of the best timberland in Russia for myself, that I have already copped off the Trans-Siberian Railway, copped off Trans-Siberian Railway, that they have given me a monopoly of the platinum of Russia, that this explains my working for the Soviet. You will hear that talk. Now, I do not think it is true, Commissioner, but let us assume that it is true. Let us assume that I am here to capture Russia for Wall Street, an American businessman. Let us assume that you are a British wolf and I am an American wolf, and that when this war is over, we are going to eat each other up for the Russian market. Let us do so in perfectly frank man fashion, but let us assume at the same time that we are fairly intelligent wolves, and that we know that if we do not hunt together in this hour, the German wolf will eat us both up. And then let us go to work." U.S. Senate Bolshevik Propaganda, hearings before a subcommittee of the Committee on the Judiciary, 65th Congress, 1919, page 802. With this in mind, let us look at Thompson's personal motivations. Thompson was a financier, a promoter, and although without previous interest in Russia, had personally financed the Red Cross mission to Russia and used the mission as a vehicle for political maneuvering. From the total picture, we can deduce that Thompson's motives were primarily financial and commercial. Specifically, Thompson was interested in the Russian market and how this market could be influenced, diverted, and captured for post-war exploitation by a Wall Street syndicate or syndicates. Certainly, Thompson viewed Germany as an enemy, but less a political enemy than an economic or commercial enemy. German industry and German banking were the real enemy. To outwit Germany, Thompson was willing to place seed money on any political power vehicle that would achieve his objective. In other words, Thompson was an American imperialist fighting against German imperialism, and this struggle was shrewdly recognized and exploited by Lenin and Trotsky. The evidence supports this apolitical approach. In early August 1917, William Boyce Thompson lunched at the U.S. Petrograd Embassy with Kerensky, Tereshko, and the American ambassador, Francis. Over lunch, Thompson showed his Russian guests as a cable he had just sent to the New York office of J.P. Morgan requesting transfer of 425,000 rubles to cover a personal subscription to the new Russian Liberty loan. Thompson also asked Morgan to inform my friends, I recommend these bonds as the best war investment I know. We'll be glad to look after their purchasing here without compensation, unquote. He then offered personally to take up 20% of a New York syndicate buying 5 million rubles of the Russian loan. Not unexpectedly, Kerensky and Tereshko indicated great gratification and support from Wall Street. And Ambassador Francis by cable promptly informed the State Department that the Red Cross Commission was, quote, working harmoniously with me, unquote, and that it would have, quote, excellent effect, unquote. Other writers have recounted how Thompson attempted to convince the Russian peasants to support Kerensky by investing $1 million of his own money in U.S. government funds on the same order of magnitude in propaganda activities. Subsequently, the Committee on Civic Education in Free Russia, heading by the revolutionary grandmother Brezhovskaya and David Soskies, Kerensky's private secretary, as executive, established newspapers, news bureaus, printing plants, and speakers bureaus to promote the appeal, fight the Kaiser, and save the revolution. It is noteworthy that the Thompson-funded Kerensky campaign had the same appeal: keep Russia in the war, as had his financial support of the Bolsheviks. The common link between Thompson's support of Kerensky and his support of Trotsky and Lenin was continue the war against Germany and keep Germany out of Russia. In brief, behind and below the military, diplomatic, and political aspects of World War I, there was another battle raging, namely a maneuvering for post-war world economic power by international operators with significant muscle and influence. Thompson was not a Bolshevik. He was not even pro-Bolshevik. Neither was he pro-Kerensky, nor was he even pro-American. The overriding motivation was the capturing of the post-war Russian market. This was a commercial, not an ideology objective. Ideology could sway revolutionary operators like Kerensky, Trotsky, Lenin, et al., but not financiers. The Lloyd George Memorandum demonstrates Thompson's partiality for neither Kerensky nor the Bolsheviks. Quote, after the overthrow of the last Kerensky government, we materially aided the dissemination of the Bolshevik literature, distributing it through agents and by airplanes to the German army, unquote. This was written in mid-December 1917, only 5 weeks after the start of the Bolshevik Revolution, less than 4 months after the Thompson expressed his support for Kerensky over lunch in the American embassy. I think I'm gonna stop there. Thank you for being here, y'all. We're on page 98. Let's see. Okay. There are 180 pages and 3 appendices. I think 3 appendices in this book. All right. We are halfway there. Thank you for being here. We've read this much so far. We have this to go. That's the back end.